I am Judy Peacock. I will be presenting your session this afternoon. I currently work as an assistive technology specialist in Florida. In my past jobs, I've worked for the state of Florida, Florida DOE, as part of the Problem Solving and Response to Intervention Project. Before that, I worked as a district assistive technology specialist for some other districts, and then before that, I was actually a classroom teacher. So I have been very interested in UDL for many years now, and looking at how to share the message of how we can do some simple things to make sure that all of our students are having the same opportunities to learning. So, like I said, this is the second session, and today we're going to focus on the recognition network. So when we talk about universal, it means everyone. We talk about all students, and not just some students, not these students, those students, but all students. So when we are looking at our session goals, we're going to talk about what is meant by UDL. Hopefully you will increase your knowledge and understanding of some of the key UDL vocabulary and principles, and identify methods of engaging students, and how you can use, like I said, different strategies and techniques to get them engaged into the learning process. Now, in our first session, we focused on the affective network, which is the actual engagement. But several years ago, you'll see that there are 3 networks as part of the overall UDL framework, and they kind of rearranged them, not necessarily by importance, but they did put engagement first. And to me, engagement is by far the most important one, because I feel like if we can get our students engaged in learning, then some of the others come along. So we're still going to focus some on engagement. So I'm going to start by doing just a very brief overview or review of UDL before we jump into the specifics. Okay, so this is what I often ask when I'm doing a live presentation at conferences and get a little interaction. What is it that you think you know about UDL? Is it just good teaching? Is it differentiated instruction? Is it being reactive rather than proactive? Is it a specific strategy? We're going to find out today. Universal design learning is an approach to designing instructional methods and materials that are flexible enough from the outset to adapt and allow for learner differences. So this was written by Meyer and Rose back in 2006. David Rose was one of the founding members of the UDL, or CAST network, which is Center for Applied Special Technologies. They are located up in Massachusetts, outside of Boston, and the researchers there kind of work on doing some of the background research of implementation and ways students learn, and what it is that we can do as educators to increase that learning. So back in the 80s, some of these scientists were together, and they realized that there was a problem with education, that it was almost looking like a bell curve, and that those on either side were missing out totally. We weren't addressing those students. And so we were really teaching to, quote unquote, the average. And we were taking the students and hoping that they fell into that. Of course, those who were gifted, or those who had any learning difficulties or special needs, were falling and not getting the same opportunities. So when we talk about teaching to the average, we're going to look at how we can avoid doing that. And the video we're about to watch is actually a TED Talk by Todd Rose. Todd is actually no relation to David Rose, one of the founding members, but he addresses the average, and we quickly realize that even though we may be teaching to the average, there are no averages. So go ahead and start the video.
Please welcome to the
Can you
TED
hear?
Sonoma County stage, Todd Rose.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Thank you.
It's 1952, and the Air Force has a problem. They've got good pilots flying better planes, but they're getting worse results, and they don't know why. And for a while, they blame the pilots. They even blame the technology. And they eventually got around to blaming the flight instructors. But it turned out that the problem was actually with the cockpit. Let me explain. Imagine you're a fighter pilot. You're operating a machine that in some cases can travel faster than the speed of sound, and where issues between success and failure, sometimes life and death, can be measured in split seconds. If you're a fighter pilot, you know that your performance depends fundamentally on the fit between you and your cockpit. Because after all, what good is the best technology in the world if you can't reach the critical instruments when you need them the most? But this presents a challenge for the Air Force, because obviously pilots are not the same size. So the issue is, how do you design one cockpit that can fit the most individuals? For a long time, it was assumed that you could do this by designing for the average pilot. That almost seems intuitively right. If you design something that fit for the average size person, wouldn't it fit most people? It seems right, but it's actually wrong. And 60 years ago, an Air Force researcher, Gilbert Daniels, proved to the world just how wrong this really is and what it was costing us. Here's how he did it. He studied over 4,000 pilots, and he measured them on 10 dimensions of size. And he asked a very simple question. How many of these pilots are average on all 10 dimensions? The assumption was that most of them would be. Do you know how many really were? 0. Gilbert Daniels proved there was no such thing as an average pilot. Instead, what he found was that every single pilot had what we call a jagged size profile, right? Means you're not, no one's at the same on every dimension. And this makes sense. Just because you're the tallest person doesn't mean you're the heaviest. It doesn't mean you have the broadest shoulders or the longest torso. But this is tricky because if every pilot has a jagged size profile and you design a cockpit on average, you've literally designed it for nobody. So the Air Force realized they had a problem. And their response was bold. They banned the average. Meaning that moving forward, they refused to buy fighter jets where the cockpit was designed for an average-sized pilot. And instead, they demanded that the companies who built these planes design them to the edges of dimensions of size. Meaning that rather than design for, say, the average height, they wanted a cockpit that could accommodate as close to the shortest pilot and the tallest pilot as the technology would allow. Now, the companies that made these planes, as you could imagine, weren't happy, right? They argued and lobbied, and they said it's going to be impossible, or at least impossibly expensive, to build a flexible cockpit. But once they realized that the Air Force wasn't going to budge, suddenly it was possible. And it turned out it wasn't that expensive. And in fact, they made great strides, leveraging simple solutions that we all take for granted in our everyday lives, like adjustable seats. And as a result, the Air Force not only improved the performance of the pilots that they already had, but they dramatically expanded their talent pool. And today, we have the most diverse pool of fighter pilots ever. But here's the thing. Many of our top pilots would have never fit in a cockpit designed on average. So, most of us have never sat in the cockpit of a $150 million fighter jet, right? But we've all sat in the classroom. And I would argue I would argue that these are the cockpits of our economy. And I think we all know that we have some problems. We're spending more money than ever before, but we're getting worse results. Whether we're talking about declining test scores in math and science, or our dropout crisis, you probably know that we have over 1.2 million dropouts every single year in high school in this country. What you may not know is that at least 4% of those dropouts are known to be intellectually gifted. That means we're losing over 50,000 of our brightest minds every single year. So we know we have a problem. But do we know why? So far, we've been content to blame the students. We blame the teachers. We even blame the parents. But here's the thing. I think back to the Air Force example, and I can't help but wonder how much of this problem is just bad design. Here's what I mean. Even though we have one of the most diverse countries in the history of the world, and even though it's the 21st century, we still design our learning environments like textbooks for the average student. No kidding. We call it age appropriate, and we think it's good enough. But of course it's not. I mean, think about it. What does it even mean to design for an average student? Because a student is not one-dimensional, like struggling to gifted. Students vary on many dimensions of learning, just like they vary on dimensions of size. Here are a few obvious ones. And just like size, each student, every single one of them, has a jagged learning profile. Meaning they have strengths, they're average at some things, and they have weaknesses. We all do. Even geniuses have weaknesses. But if the fighter pilot example has taught us anything, it's this. If you design those learning environments on average, odds are you've designed them for nobody.
Okay, so I hope that watching that, it resonated with you. And what I mentioned prior is that we have been and continue to design our learning environment and our instruction for the average student, and there are no average students. And going back to when the scientists originally realized there was a problem with education, it was when they were looking at that bell curve, and then the right side of that bell curve were those 50,000 gifted students, are bright students that we have kind of ignored over the years. And if there's that many on that side, then imagine how many are on the left side of that bell curve. So that would be the premise of Universal Design for Learning, and the researchers that coined the term and developed the research and support behind it. It was that small piece of information that actually drove them toward trying to improve education in the learning environment. So like I said earlier, universal means everyone. We're not saying that it's all of our gifted students, all of our average students, or all of our special students. It's all students that we're trying to target and focus on. So it might be those students who have difficulty understanding the text at grade level or understanding the language to the students who may have physical demands that need attending. When we plan as educators, the focus should be on students' strengths, abilities, and learning preference, which will assist in increasing that student engagement piece and making the learning universal and accessible to everyone. So you'll see throughout that we'll talk a little bit about the UDL guidelines that are part of the 3 networks or 3 pillars of the framework. And these guidelines are not meant to be prescription. They're not meant to be black and white, but kind of a general strategies that can be employed to overcome those barriers that are inherent in most existing curricula. They may serve as the basis for building in the options and the flexibility that are necessary to maximize learning opportunities for all students. Like UDL itself, these guidelines are flexible and should be mixed and matched into the curriculum as appropriate. So if you haven't quickly noticed, you'll see that we're not trying to change the students. That's nearly impossible, if not impossible. We're trying to change the curriculum to work it for the students. Okay, so when the scientists started looking at universal design for learning, they took the information, the research behind universal design. Universal design was created as part of the American with Disabilities Act, and it is what drove the things that we all use today, such as the curb cuts, those little areas on the sidewalk where we walk across the street. We use it for bicycles, strollers, wheelchairs, and such. Ramps into a building and automatic doors. A lot of the things that we actually take for granted today were actually originally designed for those individuals with disabilities. So what it has proven is that when we design things with everyone in mind, when we predict those barriers, then we are actually designing for everyone. So I know many of us have different experiences of using different things, but I'm sure that all of us at one time or another has benefited from things like the ramp going into a building if you're loaded down with packages, or the automatic doors coming out of the grocery store. As you see in the top left picture, those ramps are super nice when we have strollers and we don't have to carry them down. It's easy just to push it down. Sorry for the pauses. It's taking just a little bit for the slides to move there. Here we go. Okay, so UDL in practice. Like I said, it draws upon and extends educational approaches with which many educators are already familiar with. We already do a lot of these things. It's just focusing in on them and making sure that we are addressing them and making sure that we are predicting some of these barriers that our students are coming into our classes with. UDL is designed to emphasize teachers as guides or facilitators, learning as a process, and student construction of knowledge with active rather than passive engagement.
Judy, I'm having issues with the audio. I'm not sure if anyone else is. If you're having issues with the audio, can you please type in the chat box?
Oh dear, I'm sorry.
And it might just be my connection, Judy.
Okay.
I'm not seeing anyone else, so I apologize. Go ahead.
Okay. I guess we're hoping that they can hear to begin with. I would think they would let us know, though, so I think we're good. Okay. Let's go ahead to the next slide. The goal of UDL is, and Okay, it's to eliminate those unnecessary barriers to learning without eliminating challenges in order to ensure all learners achieve standards. We're not watering down the curriculum. We're not making it any less challenging for students. We're just making sure that those barriers are eliminated as much as possible as we plan our instruction. It's important to remember that UDL maintains high expectations for all learners. Remember, universal means all. It ensures access to academic standards for all learners. It ensures student interaction and engagement with content for all learners. Okay, the benefits of universal design. Once again, we're addressing that's proactive. We're planning for these things. We are often well-seasoned educators, and we know that some of our students are going to come with certain barriers. And so if we go ahead and plan those in a proactive manner, then we can definitely increase the effectiveness and efficiency of instructional planning. Universal design provides options for everyone, engaging and supporting all students. It also increases effectiveness of instruction, reducing the need for remediation and intervention. By ensuring that we are providing multiple means of learning, which we'll address, such as visual, auditory, kinesthetic students, will be able to clearly understand, by connecting through their preference of learning. We all know that we learn in our own way. Many of you do great with a webinar such as this, with information in front of you and the information being shared with you. Some may prefer to listen to it on their own, and some may prefer not to have the sound, or they might prefer to have a live session. So we know that our students are coming to the classrooms with those same learning preferences. Okay. We've talked about the networks, and we know that we're focusing on the recognition network. Last time we talked about the effective network, and when this is the what of learning. And this is often referred to as multiple means of representation, how we're delivering and presenting the information. We're providing flexible methods of presentations, and we offer various ways to acquire the information and knowledge. This chart actually represents visually the connection that the three principles make in the brain, therefore helping the educator and student better create pathways of learning at the most basic level in the brain's neural networks. And so for the session, like I said, we'll be focusing on the what of learning. So when those early researchers and scientists came together, several of them were actually neuroscientists. And so to better understand learning, they actually studied the brain and how it was working. They did all kinds of studies on looking at individuals who were doing mundane tasks that they were familiar with versus non-familiar, and they started seeing patterns of different things. And so they used part of that research to build the structure of UDL. So when we look at the what of learning, we're making sure that we are equipping our students to be more resourceful, more knowledgeable learners. And we're doing so by making sure that we are targeting things to that back part of the mind, the purple part in the picture, and providing multiple means of representation. Okay, so this is one of the pillars of the framework that I've just taken apart, and it kind of goes through and shows you the guidelines and the key points, of which we will actually go into in further depth in just a minute. But when you are looking through the guidelines, all of them may not be applicable to what you're teaching. So make sure that you're carefully selecting and applying the ones that are appropriate for your lesson for your information and for your students. Like I said earlier, they're not meant to be a prescription, but things that can be employed to help overcome some of those barriers. They should also not be applied to just one aspect of the curriculum, nor should they be used with only a few students. Remember that we're talking about all students. When we talk about universal, it's everyone. Ideally, the guidelines would be used to evaluate and plan goals, methods, and materials and assessments for the purpose of creating a fully accessible learning environment for all. Remember that learners differ in ways that they perceive and comprehend information that is presented to them. For example, those with sensory disabilities such as blindness or deafness, learning disabilities such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, language or cultural differences, and so forth may all require different ways of approaching the content. Others may simply grasp information quicker or more efficiently through visual auditory means rather than printed text. Also, learning and transfer of learning occurs when multiple representations are used because it allows the students to make connections within as well as between concepts. In short, there is not one means of representation that will be optimal for all learners, and that's why it's essential to provide multiple options. Okay, so we're going to go into the guidelines and the key points for each now. So we're going to focus on the first part would be perception. There we go. I apologize. For some reason, the PowerPoint's not wanting to work correctly today. Okay, so when we look at perception, we need to make sure that we are focusing on offering ways of customizing the display of information. If you're looking at print materials, the display of information is fixed and permanent. In properly prepared digital materials, the display of the same information is very malleable and customizable. For example, a call-out box of background information may be displayed in a different location, or enlarged, or emphasized by the use of color, or deleted entirely. Such malleability provides options for increasing the perceptual clarity and salience of information for a wide range of learners and adjustments for preferences of others. Just like I said earlier, we all have our own preferences, and some of you may find this type of delivery of information as being engaging. Some of you need it presented in a different format. And so that's what we're talking about when we are talking about multiple means of representation. These customizations are often difficult with print materials, and so sometimes we have to turn them into digital materials and then hope that we can customize them. And I think this is one of the biggest issues in education right now, is that we're trying to make sure that all of our printed text, our textbooks, are available in a digital format. And a digital format to some means a different thing to others. And we're making sure that our publishers are understanding that when we say we want it in a digital format, we don't want just a picture of it. We want to be able to manipulate that text if we need to make it a larger print, if we need to change the contrast colors, if we need to change the font, or something like that. We want to make sure that we're able to do that. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about properly prepared digital materials and making them accessible. Educators and learners should work together to obtain the best match of features for learning needs. Okay, some other ways that we can talk about perception and how that we can present the content and information in various ways. We talked about the contrast, the text or image. If you're listening to an audio book, it might be that you need to change the rate or speed of the sound of the voice. the speed or timing of the video, animation, sound simulations, the layout of visual or other elements, and of course the font used for print materials. Oftentimes our students, as educators, I know we like to use a variety of fonts, and sometimes we end up with those curly ones that look cute, when those are often difficult to read for some of our students. So we kind of need to go back to a basic one. I recently read where there's actually a new font that's been developed that's supposed to be easier to read for students with dyslexia. If you were to see it, it's kind of, you can barely tell the difference. At the bottom, it's weighted a little bit more in the black area. So just simple things that might make it easier for our students. We can also offer alternatives for auditory information. Sound is particularly effective way to convey the impact of information, which is why sound design is so important in movies, and why the human voice is particularly effective for conveying emotion and significance. Think back to the last movie you went to watch at the theater, and there's those really loud sounds that they project, and then it kind of calms down. That is their way of conveying emotion and significance in the movie. And so we listen to that and we react to that in a different way. You also hear it in the human voice. I heard one time that recorded books, when they were done with a voice that had an accent, a foreign accent, that we often listened more intently because it was something that engaged us, something that we wanted to listen to more. However, information conveyed solely through sound is not equally accessible to all learners, and is especially inaccessible for learners with hearing disabilities, or for learners who need more time to process information, or learners who have memory difficulties. So if you notice back in the video of Todd Rose talking about the average student, you notice that there was closed caption. Now, on my end, I actually couldn't hear the video at all like you could, so it was important for me to be able to read it, although I don't have a hearing disability. But for those of you who do, or for our students that do, then that was an extra little feature that made it easier and kind of equated things for everyone so that everyone had access to it. It also made it, if you noticed, it was a high contrast color, so that helped some of our visual learners. So in addition, listening itself is a complex strategic skill that must be learned. We kind of joke that sometimes we can hear things, but we're not listening. Listening is a very specific skill that is learned. We want to ensure that all learners have access to learning options should be available for any information, including emphasis, presented orally. When we use text equivalents in the form of captions, like I talked about, the closed captions are automated speech-to-text, voice recognition for spoken language. If you watch sports on Saturday morning, you know that oftentimes the commentators are talking, and it's also being translated kind of in a closed caption way, that there's often missed words or misspellings, or sometimes the entire message is misconveyed, and that's because they're using really a speech-to-text software that is as accurate as it's ever been, but still not 100%. So sometimes it twists those words around and make it incomprehensible. So we want to make sure that we're making it available and accessible for our students. Sometimes it's important to provide a visual diagram, a chart, notations of music or sound. If you noticed, there's a little graphic there, and though it doesn't appear as much, the graphic shows that individuals have different perception of things. Some see the glass is half full, or some see the glass is half empty. So if you take that little simple graphic there and see the impact it has on understanding and the perception of information. It's also important to remember that sometimes we need to have written transcripts of videos to share, or American Sign Language for spoken English. Use visual analogs to represent emphasis and prosody. Today we've learned how to use emoticons and symbols or images to convey our message when we're using text on our smartphones. And we can provide visual or tactile equivalents for sound effects or alerts. I know many of us have smartphones and smartwatches, and if you're like me, you have the sound off, even on your watch, and when you receive a notification, it has a little vibration so that we feel that. But that's also important for those who might have a hearing disability so that they are not dependent on hearing something. Let me get the PowerPoint to move. Sorry, guys. There we go. Okay, so when we get to this point, we're looking at ways that we can also provide alternatives to visual information. If you're not familiar with it, we have national standards called NIMAS, which are National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standards that actually guide the publishers and the companies that are providing these materials, making them accessible for our students. There's some other standards. DAISY is another one that says that when we're creating digital text, we need to allow for a competent aid, partner, or intervener to read text aloud or provide access to text-to-speech software. DAISY actually has an automated speech that reads it. NIMAS is making sure that those texts are available in a format that we can change in whatever way we need to for our students. Okay, after perception and the recognition network, we move on to language, expression, and symbols. And this is kind of the next guideline and checkpoint underneath that. And we look at how learners vary in their facility with different forms of representation, both linguistic and non-linguistic. Vocabulary that may sharpen and clarify concepts for one learner may be opaque and foreign to another. An equal sign might help some learners understand that the two sides of the equation need to be balanced, but might cause confusion to a student who does not understand what it means. A graph that illustrates the relationship between two variables may be informative to one learner and inaccessible or puzzling to another. So think back to the times when we were in school when we did have to look at graphs, and we did have to look at charts, and unless we were familiar with the research and what it was, the information that was being depicted in those, we were clueless. Just because we saw a graph or a chart, without background knowledge, we were not familiar with what was going on. Remember that a picture or image that carries meaning for some learners may carry very different meanings for learners from differing cultural or familiar backgrounds. A lot of things that we use in America are not the same symbols that we use that are used around the world. I know that when I've traveled outside of the country, there were some symbols I had to learn to be able to find simple things as the restroom or which way to the train or the bus. And so just because we think it's a common symbol or graphic doesn't mean that it's easily recognized and is common for others. An important instructional strategy is to ensure that alternative representations are provided not only for accessibility, but for clarity and comprehensibility across all learners. So this is one of those situations where just because you give the instructions verbally doesn't mean that they're being understood universally. And so you may have to share that in multiple ways. Okay. Slide. Okay, so we're going to clarify. It just jumped ahead, and we're just going to let it, so we don't have to worry about it. This next little checkpoint is clarify vocabulary and symbols. Sometimes, as we know very well, that where a word is in a sentence or how it's being used can sometimes be confusing. So the semantic elements through which information is presented, the words, the symbols, numbers, and icons, are differentially accessible to learners with various backgrounds and lexical knowledge. To ensure accessibility for all, key vocabulary labels, icons, and symbols should be linked to or associated with alternate representations of their meaning, such as an embedded glossary or definition, a graphic equivalent, a chart, or a map. You think about it, this is another thing that technology has given us lately, is the ability to, if you're using a word processing document on a computer, to actually just click the word, and it gives you the definition, it gives you synonyms, it might direct you for more information. This actually happens on a lot of our smartphones and our tablets as well. That's a tool that's already been built in that we use, once again, that makes life a little bit easier sometimes, but it can also be critical in making sure that our students understand things. Idioms, archaic expressions, culturally exclusive phrases, and slang, we should make sure that we're translating them. Once again, there are a lot of things we can say in America, but if a student's in our classroom that's not using English as their first language, their native language, they could be very confused. We need to make sure that we pre-teach vocabulary and symbols, especially in ways that promote connection to the learner's experience and prior knowledge. I think this is a given for educators. We know that our students are coming to us with various backgrounds, various experiences, whether it be at home, whether it be in their families, at school, what they've experienced in their neighborhoods, all kinds of different things have impacted their background and their experiences. We need to make sure that we provide graphic symbols with alternative text descriptions. This is a big one on the internet when we're looking at web pages, is making sure that we have added in an alternate text description so that when students who need a little extra support are able to mouse over or roll over a picture, it gives them the actual text to clarify that. Highlight how complex terms, expressions, or equations are composed of simpler words or symbols. Embed support for vocabulary and symbols within the text. This is, again, one of those digital things that we've become accustomed to, but we need to ensure are still there, such as hyperlinks or footnotes, the definitions, explanations, illustrations, previous coverage, or even translations for some of our students. We need to ensure that we're embedding support for unfamiliar references within the text, such as domain-specific notation, lesser-known properties and theorems, idioms, academic language, figurative language, mathematical language, jargon, archaic language, colloquialism, and dialect. So when we're making sure that our students are having the ability to access it from different representations, we need to make sure that all of these are being considered when sharing with our students. Okay, so we're going to leave the slide here since it jumped ahead for us, and we're going to talk about a little bit more. Actually, excuse me, we're going to go on to the next one. I covered some of that. Okay, so in this point, we're going to make sure that we are supporting decoding text, mathematical notation, and symbols. And I'll go ahead and tell you, math is still the hardest area to make accessible for students. We're constantly looking for ways to make math more accessible for all learners. So if we're looking at this checkpoint, we want to make sure that we're continuing to promote understanding across the languages. The language of curricular materials is usually monolingual, but often the learners in the classroom are not. So the promotion of cross-linguistic understanding is especially important for new learners of the dominant language or for learners of academic language. The accessibility of information is greatly reduced when no linguistic alternatives are available. Ensuring that we're providing alternatives, especially for key information, the vocabulary is an important aspect of accessibility. So some ways in which we can do that are making sure that all the key information in the dominant language, which is often English, is also available in first languages for our students, their native languages, for learners with limited English proficiency, and of course in American Sign Language for learners who are deaf. We need to make sure that we're linking key vocabulary words to definitions and pronunciations in both dominant and heritage languages. We can also define domain-specific vocabulary, such as a map key in social studies, using both domain-specific and common terms, provide electronic translation tools or links to multilingual glossaries on the web, and using visual, non-linguistic supports for vocabulary clarification. Sometimes we actually need a picture or a video to explain the vocabulary. Sometimes it's the picture that explains, it's the vocabulary, that explains the picture. So it goes both ways. The next checkpoint is illustrate through multimedia. Looks like the picture covered that, sorry. And this is one we've been doing a lot in education, is presenting it through multimedia. We've been doing this since we started showing videos. There was the day in which we used PowerPoint for everything. So we've been using multimedia, but it goes a little beyond that. Often we're sharing nothing but text, and text is a weak format for presenting many concepts for explicating most processes. Furthermore, text is a particularly weak form of presentation for learners who have text or language-related disabilities. Providing alternatives, especially illustrations, simulations, images, or interactive graphics, can make the information in text more comprehensible for any learner and accessible for some who would find it completely inaccessible in text. Some ways in which we can do this are making sure that we present key concepts in one form of symbolic representation, such as an expository text or a math equation, with an alternative form, such as illustration, maybe a dance movement, a diagram, a table, a model, a video, maybe a comic strip, storyboard, photograph, animation, physical or virtual manipulatives. This is when I like to go back and point out, when I was in the classroom, I was an elementary teacher, so it's easy to use this example. Oftentimes we have our students read a book and then write a book report. Well, oftentimes really what we're trying to get them to demonstrate is their comprehension of that book. And if that's the case, then we can actually have them demonstrate their comprehension in a variety of ways. I know I've had them, make the posters, make a video. The same time, our students know more about the technology than we do, so they're more than well-versed in making videos or comic strips online. Make explicit links between information provided in text and any accompanying representation of that information in illustrations, equations, charts, or diagrams. Speaking of comprehension, is our last guideline. And the purpose of our education is really not to make information accessible, but rather to teach learners how to transform accessible information into usable knowledge. Decades of cognitive research have demonstrated that the capability to transform accessible information into usable knowledge is not a passive process, but an active one. When we are constructing usable knowledge, it is accessible for future decision making. Depends not upon merely perceiving information, but upon active information processing skills like selective attending, integrating the information with prior knowledge, strategic categorization, and active memorization. Individuals differ greatly in their skills in information processing, as we all know, and in their access to prior knowledge through which they can assimilate new information. It's important that proper design and presentation of information, which is the responsibility of any curriculum or instructional methodology, can provide the scaffolds necessary that all learners have access to the knowledge. So it's important that we make sure that the information that we're sharing is that we activate or supply that background knowledge, which is what we talked about just a few minutes ago, of making sure that we're aware that our students are coming to our classrooms with various backgrounds, but also making sure that we activate that. So some of the barriers and iniquities exist when some learners lack the background knowledge that is critical to assimilating or using new information. Those barriers can be reduced when options are available that supply or activate relevant prior knowledge or link to the prerequisite information elsewhere. Some ways that we can use this is using advanced organizers such as KWL methods or concept maps, pre-teaching critical prerequisite concepts through demonstration or models, or bridge concepts with relevant analogies and metaphors. If we're making sure that we're making some of those connections and using some of those tools, then we're making it a little bit more accessible. So we're actually running a little behind on time, so I'm going to go through the next couple rather quickly. So if we are focusing on guiding information processing, visualization, and manipulation, it often requires the application of mental strategies and skills for processing information. These cognitive or metacognitive strategies involve the selection and manipulation of transformation so that it can be better summarized, categorized, prioritized, or contextualized, and remembered. Some ways that we can do this is giving explicit prompts for each step in a sequential process. Provide options for organizational methods and approaches. Provide interactive models. Introduce graduated scaffolds. And provide multiple entry points to a lesson and optional pathways through content. Progressively release information and remove any unnecessary distractions unless they are essential to the instructional goal. So the last checkpoint for this one is maximize transfer and generalization. All students need to be able to generalize and transfer their learning to new contexts. Students vary in the amount of scaffolding they need for memory and transfer in order to improve their ability to assess their prior learning. And of course, all learners can benefit from assistance in how to transfer the information they have to other situations, as learning is not about individual facts in isolation, and students need multiple representations for this to occur. Without this, the use of multiple representations, information might be learned, but is inaccessible in new situations. The supports for memory, generalization, and transfer include techniques that are designed to heighten the memorability of the information as well as those that prompt and guide learners to employ explicit strategies. And this is the one that I probably like the most, some of the ideas, because we've been using a lot of these over the years, is providing checklists, organizers, sticky notes, electronic reminders, which I use all of right now, trying to get organized, prompt the use of mnemonic strategies and devices, incorporate explicit opportunities for review and practice, and of course, embed new ideas and familiar ideas in context. So oftentimes when we talk about UDL, there's a big connection to technology, but it's important to remember that technology is not UDL in and of itself. It's how we use that technology. So you don't have to have access to the latest technology in order to apply UDL. It's a new way of thinking. Our work taught us that when education fails, barriers to learning are likely found in the curriculum, not in individual learners who follow along a long continuum of diverse abilities, interests, and skills. As a result, the burden to adapt must, as a first step, be placed where it belongs, on the curriculum itself. So that concludes our day, our afternoon together of sharing information about the Recognition Network and making sure that we are considering our students' learning preferences. We're considering the fact that they are not all average students and ensuring that we are making sure the information is represented in a variety of ways so that our students are able to access it. So thank you for joining us on the second session. Are there any questions you may have? Okay, well, so far we don't have any questions. If you're thinking of any, you have time to continue typing them in. Here in this last slide is the resources. I pulled my materials and resources from path.org, which is also connected to the udlcenter.org. As you see, there's my name and contact information. If you ever have any questions, anything I can do to help support you, please let me know. Again, I appreciate you taking time in your afternoon. I know it's late for some of you, so I appreciate it. Thanks for hanging in there with me.